The 2024 presidential election is almost here, but it may take some time to figure out who exactly won the election. I'm John Doman, and I'm a senior politics reporter at Business Insider. States like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, they're very close, and it would not be surprising to see those states not be called on election night, mostly because of the networks want to get it right. But there are some states, more safely Democratic or safely Republican states. Those states will be called relatively early. Pennsylvania is a good example of a state where ballots can't be processed before Election Day, but it's going to provide a lot of clues to the eventual winner. Donald Trump on election night in 2020 had a pretty sizable advantage in Pennsylvania, but that was because a lot of smaller, more conservative counties report their results earlier. They have smaller populations, but Donald Trump's lead narrowed significantly in Pennsylvania when the vote came in from Philadelphia, which is the largest city in the state, and it's a Democratic stronghold. There was an enormous Biden advantage. It allowed him to really overcome Trump. So in this election cycle in Pennsylvania, it could be several days before we know. California has a much more liberal policy when it comes to ballots being returned. The final result in California will probably not be known for a week or more. Because ballots can still trickle in and they don't have to be received by Election Day. While Kamala Harris is widely expected to win California very easily, I will say there are several House races that could determine the majority of the U.S. House of Representatives. So the outcome of the House could be in doubt, actually, for potentially a week or more if those swing districts in California that are highly contested, depending on when the ballots come in, we could see a situation where we don't know who controls the House for a while. In 2020, Georgia was a state that Donald Trump at the time insisted that he won. There was no evidence of mass voting fraud in that state. He had a slight lead in the state on election night, but overnight and into the morning when votes from Democratic-leaning counties came in and votes from the suburbs and the Atlanta suburbs came in, Biden was able to overtake Donald Trump at the time. And it was a big deal for Democrats. But Donald Trump contested and insisted that he had won the state. He tried to convince Brian Kemp, was the Republican governor, and Brad Raffensperger, who's the current Secretary of State. He tried to convince them to overturn the results. They refused to do it. So Georgia is once again expected to be very close there, but it's going to be another flashpoint in the polarization of our politics. The certification of the vote won't happen, though, until after the votes are counted. Also, if there are any particular recounts, which may occur in some of the more competitive states, the 2024 election cycle will also be a lot different than 2020, mostly because in 2020, millions of Americans chose to vote by mail. Voters just simply didn't want to go to the precincts because they were afraid of contracting the coronavirus. This year, that's not as much of a concern. So you're likely to see more in-person voting on election day, but also early in-person voting, which is going on right now. The speed at which certain states report the votes, it really is going to vary. After the 2000 election in Florida, which was marred by lots of discrepancies, they passed voting reform. As a result, they're generally one of the first states to report on election night. Now that the state's a little more Republican leaning, it may not provide an indicator of where the election's headed in this election cycle, but it is a great indicator of how a state can effectively have reforms and actually report the votes earlier. As for the outcome of the 2024 race going to the Supreme Court, we can take a look back at the year 2000 when it did go to the Supreme Court, but it was mainly because in Florida there was actual litigation over the intent of voters when you looked at the ballot in terms of hanging chads. I feel like that is less of an issue this year. The intent of the actual vote is one thing, but the actual certification of valid votes, it will be really hard to dispute that unless there is some sort of massive fraud. There's no indication that there will be an issue at all this year. If all goes well, we could know who won the presidency on election night. If Kamala Harris sweeps the blue wall states by a significant margin, and if she picks off most of the swing states, it will be really hard for anyone to say that Donald Trump won the election. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump, should he win the presidential race, it will be really hard to dispute the results, especially if he has over 300 electoral votes and he has not only a popular vote margin, but a significant electoral vote margin. But as it stands, the race is very close. We may not know who won the election for several days, but if the result comes a little sooner, there'll definitely be a relief to a lot of voters who pretty much probably want the election to be over.